This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
All right, welcome to Unfragmented. And once again, we're Leigh, Bortons, and I, and our participants explored the cohesion of things believed with things done. So we're interested in Christian action, ultimately as a function of what we think. Today is July 27, 2023, and time is flying here. We're in our fourth and final week of reviewing our founding documents. I'm Kevin Novak, and Leigh Bortons is our co-host. Of course, we have Christine Berry as our producer. And like I said, this month we're talking about our founding documents of week one. We talked about the Declaration of Independence. Thereafter, we talked about the Articles of Confederation. And then last week we talked about the U.S. Constitution, where we had William Federer just giving us some information about the U.S. Constitution and as it connects to biblical principles. And as always, I'll remind you, you can go to Leigh Bortons' YouTube channel to see the prior book club episodes, and go to leighbortons.com just to see what other shows are available to everyone. And this week, like I said, we're talking about the Northwest Ordinance. And what I'd like to do before I ask a question, and a broad question, and before we get into the different sections and the different articles, is I would just like to give a summary of the Northwest Ordinance. This is actually from the National Archives. I didn't see anything partisan in it, so I figured it'd be safe to share. Of course, you always have to be on the lookout for even summaries of founding documents. But here, I'll share with you this summary of the Northwest Ordinance. So it is officially titled An Ordinance for the Government of the Territory of the United States Northwest of the River Ohio. The Northwest Ordinance was adopted on July 13, 1787 by the Confederation Congress, the one-house legislature operating under the Articles of Confederation. The Northwest Ordinance chartered a government for the Northwest Territory, provided a method for admitting new states to the Union from the territory, and listed a Bill of Rights guaranteed in the territory. Following the principles outlined by Thomas Jefferson in the Ordinance of 1784, the authors of the Northwest Ordinance, probably Nathan Dane and Rufus King, spelled out a plan that was subsequently used as the country expanded to the Pacific. So that's just some background procedural information. I did see some information. Again, I'll mention this America's Providential History book. There's some basic information in there and some citations relating to the Northwest Ordinance. We know those gentlemen, Mark Beliles and Steve McDowell, know what they're referring to. So we'd like to get into eventually just the sections and the articles, but if you don't mind me just asking a probing question, something that I'm interested in with our participants and our audience is wanting to ask people directly, does anyone have any thoughts on the different provisions that we've encountered, say in the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, now the Northwest Ordinance? Not necessarily, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but not necessarily invoking express biblical provisions, if that makes sense. So, of course, the framers, generally being Christian, generally being God-fearing, trying to build a Christian civil government, separation of powers, and the checks and balances, and trying to build a civil government built on the premise that we're all sinners by nature. Are there any initial thoughts on that, where we see some provisions in here that don't necessarily invoke express biblical principles? If that makes sense.
So you're just saying in the other three documents, because we haven't gone through this one as a review?
Yes. Yeah, I would say generally.
Yeah, so even if you aren't acquainted biblical ideas, if somebody who's modern reads through those, it's like it's a totally different language, even though it's English. And for those who do read the Bible, you recognize the similar sentence structure and the style of writing and addressing people as royalty and nobility, expecting good of people, expecting things to go really well. And when these documents are written, it seems like they're writing them going, but by the way, we also know that evil exists. And so these are the simplest, closest ways we can fix things. There's no great big 5-year plan or scheme behind any of this.
Yeah, and that, one of the things I was thinking of is a jury trial, and we can talk more about that here in a little bit, but I noticed that is in Article 2. So the jury trial, not necessarily something that I know of is expressly cited in the Old Testament, but, and people have tried to invoke the example of the disciples and having a unanimous opinion. That's okay. I'm not against that. But that would be a modern example of checks and balances and having the people be able to check tyranny. So I think I'm comfortable with these things. But I was just curious what other people think. You get different Christian thinkers and people wanting to expressly invoke, say, the Old Testament. I'm not afraid of the Old Testament. But in a modern application, things do seem to play out differently, and I'm okay with something like a jury trial.
Mm-hmm.
But if anyone doesn't have any other thoughts on that, we can start going through the different sections here.
Why don't you finish your thoughts so we have an example of what you're trying to get us to respond to? I'm not sure I understand the question. So let's look at that Article 2. What is it exactly? Read some of it. What exactly are you referring to when you look at that?
Well, so the Section 2, let me go to, I think I called it Article 2.
With the jury trial.
Yeah.
Right, it's Article 2.
So there's some things where we've got rid of habeas corpus, which is basically saying you can't hold someone in prison without there being a legal reason to do so. And if your legal remedies are writ. Jury trial, you've got the common law mentioned in there. You've got bail. You've got cruel and unusual punishment cited, due process, then takings, and then you've got the contracts clause. So you've got different things in there. So I will just say, let's take bail as a difficult example purposely, in that I don't know of bail being mentioned in the Old Testament or the New Testament, but in looking at that being a mechanism for restraining evil, and that we also don't have a modern mechanism for involuntary servitude, I was just wondering if people are comfortable with that, in that it could be argued that that's a biblical mechanism. You could attach it to biblical principles, but it's not necessarily expressly mentioned in Scripture, if that makes sense. And wondering if everyone's okay with that.
Well, doesn't it relate to, I still don't think people know what you mean. So doesn't the idea of bail relate to the fact that there was sanctuary cities and they couldn't come get you there until it was time for your trial? And I mean, so if you live near a sanctuary city, you had a place to be protected and yet not to escape from either. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, so where do you see bail as being a biblical idea?
Well, I wrestle with that. I do think when I look at bail, and I cringe when I see that Illinois has essentially outlawed the idea of bail, but I'm comfortable with it, even though it doesn't exactly mirror what's in the Old Testament. So there is this exception in Article 2 relating to capital cases. Here in Texas, there are two. You have a right to bail except in capital cases and domestic violence cases. Other than that, you will be issued some type of bail. But I guess my question is, just because it doesn't expressly mirror what's in the Old Testament, does that make it unbiblical or biblical?
Okay.
Um,
That's your
and
real
so
question.
Yeah, and I'm curious what other people really have to think, because it's not like I've got, I walk around with thoughts about these, but I wouldn't say that I have all the answers to every single issue.
Mm-hmm. So do the other five of you understand what he's asking?
I think I get what he's saying now. I just feel like I'm not knowledgeable enough of a lot of like Old Testament law to really probably have a good determination on whether we would consider Baal biblical or unbiblical.
Yeah.
But I get, I totally get what Kevin's saying now. But it's something I'd probably have to really think about.
Well, I think it's a good question for all of us as we go through it. Anybody else want to? What do you think about what Kevin's asking?
I think I understand the question also, but I would have to agree with Nicole. Like, I think I would need to think on it more before because I haven't thought on it previously.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm still not sure if I would come to a position.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing that comes to my mind is that I would think these documents are not the only place where we need to make decisions that don't have an express answer in the Bible. And so maybe, like, stop me if I'm not understanding your question correctly, but I'm thinking, well, where are other places where we have to decide something, or we have to set out principles, or we have to set out guidelines that may or may not be addressed directly in scripture. And I would think there are other places. I mean, I think first, like within our own families, as we have to set up rules and things for our children, for such action, such consequence shall be, is we have to apply principles oftentimes rather than things that are expressly stated. And so I'm not sure if that's addressing what you're asking, but if it is, then I think I'm okay with making choices, making decisions, setting up systems that may not be expressly addressed in the Bible, but so long as they do not violate biblical principles. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Does that
So
answer
we'll
what you're
explore
asking?
that. Yeah. Does it, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. I've got a hierarchy of, actually, I'm thankful that I kept some of my constitutional law notes, because I had an intelligent Christian teaching me. And some of these things, and I don't want to bore everybody with a bunch of legalese, but some of these things I was just revisiting. And, you do have things like general principles of law. In fact, there's a Chief Justice John Marshall, who you can study. He was a Virginian, and he talked about these very things. And the common law is talked about in Article 2. So that when they say common law, they mean Blackstone law, not to be confused with case law. So I would agree with you. I mean, I think that, I guess a more explicit example might be like, well, the firstborn, is it improper for nowadays for the firstborn male to not get a double portion? So I guess I was just wondering, that would be a more express example of what I was asking about. But I would agree with you. We've got to look at general principles and things like that. And even the U.S. Constitution is not that wordy. So we do have to look to things like the common law and framers' intent and biblical intent, I would think, too.
Yeah. How about you, Ms. Snap?
I would follow along the same dialogue as Nicole and Jennifer. I think for me, I'd have to go back and reread these, thinking with that question in mind as I'm reading them, instead of, because I read it with a different lens, really. But yeah, towards the end of your conversation when you first started this, I did finally understand what you were talking about. So, yeah, I don't have anything to add to it other than to go back and probably relook at these with that thought in mind.
Yeah, so I would say there's two things going on with this article. That would be important to me, having them in the Challenge 1 program and the age of those young folks studying it, as well as the parents' lack of familiarity, is that there's three things to do. The one is to just be able to read the words, which is the actual assignment that they're given is, could you rewrite this or explain what parts of it mean? And that's probably the lens we were reading it in. Then the second one is, once you know what it means, then to go back and say, all right, how does this relate to life now? And then the third one is, and are they biblical principles or not? And if they're not biblical principles, then are they justified? So those are like a lot of questions. And for the classical conversation purpose, all we're trying to do, so parents are aware, is make sure that to give your students an opportunity to wrestle with difficult documents, to make the point of two things. One, that these were documents the average 12-year-old could read in 1776. So we have really fallen in our proficiency, but it shows you what we can do with our children if we will just make literature really important in their lives. And I forgot what the other one was while I was talking about that. Anyway, so we want you to be able to read it, and we want you to know that you can read it as a child and not to give up. Oh, I know what the other point is. On the pedagogical side, parents understand that somewhere around 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, you have to sit your child on your lap or next to you and go sound by sound, letter by letter, to teach them to read, right? To teach them phonics. But for some reason, parents think once their kids know how to read, they can read anything. And these documents show that it's just not true. And so the beauty of what we're doing in Challenge 1 in this seminar, by not giving them other work to do, is to say your only job is to take these difficult sentences and go word by word and phrase by phrase and learn how to read things you're unfamiliar with, because that's a skill also. So does that help to see why it's in the curriculum?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Because this 50-something even had difficulty reading it the first time with my Challenge 1 kids.
Yeah, me too.
Mhm.
That's exactly why I became a classicalist. I was a voracious reader. I was very well schooled and horribly educated. And when I went to try to read these documents with my 14-year-old Robert and realized I didn't even know what they meant, I was like, this will never happen in our family again. And that's why we stuck to the rigors of a classical education while homeschooling, because we also have this delight-directed attitude and want to have fun while we're working on school too.
Mhm.
So with saying that, why don't we go ahead and do you have a document you want to share that shows all of it, or you want me to share my screen? Because we can start reading through it together. Kevin.
I do not have, I don't have a document to present.
Okay, let me share
On
my
there.
screen then. Can you,
Okay.
Christine, can you let me share my screen?
I'll try and figure that out.
Okay. Do it.
Okay, go ahead and try.
Okay. Share screen. There it is. Okay, can you all see it?
Yes.
All right. So why don't we quietly, just for like a minute, just read section 1 and nod when you're done.
Can you zoom in on that a little bit,
I'm
Leigh?
sorry. Yes, I can. I forgot.
Or else I'm turning my camera off.
You know what? It's not letting me. Wonder why. Huh. Well, I lied to you. It's something about being on Zoom that's not letting it zoom. Oh, isn't that funny? Okay, then read. Can you read your own document?
Yes, yes. Ours just doesn't have section 1s and 2s in it, the one that I have.
Hmm.
So section 1 goes, what's the last sentence in section 1?
The last
So-
phrase is make it expedient.
Oh, that's it. Make it expedient. Okay.
So are you in the Words Aptly Spoken book, Michelle?
Yes, ma'am.
So it's page 203 and it's the first paragraph after the sort of title introduction.
Right.
Okay, so what territory is this talking about? Let's go through some of these ideas.
Well, so I looked it up because I didn't know. And well, the introduction in our book talks about it being, northwest of the River Ohio or the Ohio River. Which is kind of fun because we're coming to cycle 3 this year. And so we're going to be looking at that in foundations, and it'll be fun to tell our families. We can look forward to that again. But it's this large territory that is not a state yet. So this is 1787, and this is after the Articles of Confederation, but prior to the Constitution. And it's an area that is part of the United States, but is not a state. So it doesn't, as I understand it anyways, doesn't really fall under those documents. And it seems to be some kind of, contest in this area. There seems to be some contestation. So it's a large area of land, and later on in the document, it talks about dividing it into no less than 3 and no more than 5 states. And so when I looked it up, it comprises, for the most part, what is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, both parts of Michigan, Wisconsin, and like
Indiana.
like a little part of Minnesota. But not all, from what I'm looking at on my map, not all of Minnesota, but it looks like Minnesota's kind of like tucked in with Wisconsin.
I think it's Indiana too. It's Indiana's in it as well. Did you say Indiana?
I think that's in that little strip of 3 that go right along the river, the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois.
Yeah.
So if you go to Article 5, which you mentioned, Jennifer, when you said it describes it more, it mentions the states of Ohio and Mississippi River and the Lake of the Woods. It gives you geographical terms, but I'm glad you guys looked it up, because one thing the students may not know while they're reading this, like you should be able to read Article 5 and you would think you could figure out what the Northwest Territory was. The problem with that, though, is the borders of the colonies changed after this was written. And that's why you have things like West Virginia.
Yes.
And things broken off. So,
well, and so I also noticed, but this I couldn't find. I hope I'm not jumping around too much.
No, do it.
So before the articles really begin, let me see if I can find it again. Okay, so this would be 1, 2. Perhaps it's in your section 2, I'm not sure, but in our book, it's at the top of page 204, and it is part of the second paragraph. It's a large paragraph, and it talks about settlers of the Kaskaskis, St. Vincent's, and neighboring villages. And I was trying to look up where those areas are, because the Kaskaskis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, sounds like an area more than a township, but all I could find when I was looking it up is a town, Kaskaskia. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And it was interesting because this is similar, or this reminded me of, we talked about a few weeks ago, some rights applying to people, but not vagabonds, and I can't remember the other term we used. And this is similarly saying it's accepting these people from what it's talking about here, the French and Canadian inhabitants, and then other settlers of this Kaskaskis area, St. Vincent's and neighboring villages. And I wasn't able to, well, and then it kind of does say it's because they've professed themselves to be citizens of Virginia. and are adhering to their laws.
Yeah, and
Um,
then interesting, they're way up by the St. Lawrence River, I believe is where that is, and yet they're calling themselves citizens of Virginia.
Yes. So Kaskaskia, the city that I was able to find, if it is the same area or if it's part of that area, was, according to what I was reading, a capital of Illinois. Or did you say Illinois or Indiana? But Illinois, when Illinois came into the Union, and that seems to me to be very far away from Virginia.
Well, Virginia used to go way beyond the West Virginia border when it was first a
That's
colony.
true. That's right. They did. They were very long. So
So,
Carolinas as well, right?
right. So the reason I wanted to jump in on this geography is because if your kids can understand nothing about this document while you're reading it with them, I bet your family can pull out a map and do what Jennifer did and at least try to find the locations of the place. And if that's all you get done, well done, mom and dad. That is really a good thing, right? Because it's now made us look at 3 different paragraphs of the article. And you may still not read the sentence. You may not catch where, because it's unusual language where it says heretofore profess themselves citizens of Virginia. You may have to just talk about that phrase and right. But at least the names of the proper nouns you could look up. So that's one way to start going through this. And like, we're not even at the Bible yet. We're just trying to read this thing. Okay. So you had said earlier, Michelle, there was something you wanted to talk about. You want to jump to there and see what kind of exercise we get out of that with our children. And then Kevin, I still want to end talking about the legal stuff, but I want people to know that you can just look at it and do a good job.
So it's the bottom of page 204 in the Words Aptly Spoken American Documents. It's the last paragraph. So it starts off talking about the prevention of crimes and injuries. The laws to be adopted or made shall have force in all parts of the district for the execution of process, criminal and civil. The governor shall make proper divisions thereof, and he shall proceed from time to time as circumstances may require, to lay out the parts of the district in which the Indian titles shall have been extinguished into counties and townships, subject, however, to such alterations as may thereafter be made by the legislators or legislature. So, my question in the side is what Indians were in this area, and was this agreed to by the Indians? Because this is a territory that is technically not the United States. Well, then I get to Article 3, and it starts off, religion, morality, and knowledge are being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged.
But not
Then
established.
Right.
But go ahead.
Encouraged. Exactly. Yes. So the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights and liberty. They shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress, but laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them. So that, this whole thing leads me off on this big bunny trail on, well, we're going to extinguish the names that the Indians established, but then we go on to say, we will never take anything from them. So my question was, let's compare the sentiment between these 2 paragraphs, because they seem to be in stark contrast to me. And then when I'm reading, I'm hearing about this Indian war and that Indian war. And we clearly did go in and take the land from them.
So if you pay close enough attention, I totally agree with you, Michelle, and you could do a whole legal history and all this stuff. So we would, like we do now, in places like maybe Ukraine pretended there were problems that they started, and that was the war's justification, and then Congress would say, yes, you can go in and attack them. But the sentiment of peace does not seem to be what lines up with the history that we've been told, which was, you're right, Article what, 8?
3. Oh yeah,
3.
Article 8.
But I think
3,
you got
yes.
to read the one before with the counties and townships. It says I'll read again what you read, to lay out the parts of the district in which the Indian title shall have been extinguished. It's not the Indians, but it's the title to
Right.
the district. So if the Indians had moved out of Washington, DC, now it's legal to own it and to take it forward. That's what that means. It doesn't mean they did it well or right or had always good intentions, but legally they were. So which I think this document in many ways, if I was with the kids, I would say to them, okay, let's talk through this, spend a lot more time than we just did, and then say to them, how does that square up with the compromise in the Constitution about slavery, when they already were trying to give human rights to the Indians long before the Constitution came into existence? And so I would compare the words of those two documents with each other to see if there's any insight to understanding the documents. So right, when I read that, I thought, wait, it's like they love the Indians.
Right. But this doesn't really clarify that Indians may have left. The Indians could still be in there, but they, will extinguish those parts of the district that they had title to. So yeah, that was all. It just seemed like the sentiment in the third article was in stark contrast to, but I hear what you're saying too, because I did have that thought as well.
Well, we
So I
got
was
a
just
lawyer
trying to-
with us. Kevin, is there a legal term for the idea that a title being extinguished? It's a land title is what they're talking about. Is there some-
Yeah, I mean, they're talking here about fee simple later in section 9. So, well, first of all, I will say, I read section 8 a little differently. I read it as in, well, as the Indian lands and Indian peoples move on, or for whatever reason, whether it's war, battle, they move on, well, we're going to take dominion over those areas. But I read it in a more passive way. I'm not saying that's absolutely what it meant, but that's the way I read it. In terms of section 9 fee simple, we're getting into a more permanency here, and there is some, I looked up just a little bit of history on fee simple relative to representation in a different section here. But the point is, I do think there would be some difference here in what type of ownership there is in the land, because Europeans in common law would look at it more permanently than presumably the Indians, where to my knowledge, they didn't really own land. So I could see where there's a contrast there, difference of definition.
So that'd be something to talk about, that do Indians even have titles to land the way a European thinks about it?
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about that. Oh, where would they go and file their title?
Yeah.
Where's
And
the
there
DMV when you need it?
Right. Where's the assessor's office?
I know we could have another whole other conversation about the Indians versus the Europeans, and but I think that I don't remember the case, but I do know there was a Supreme Court case where basically they said, Europeans and different groups have taken over this land, and if the Indians aren't going to, basically to the victor belong the spoils. And so I think there is some of that sentiment, but that's the way the Europeans were looking at it and taking dominion and wanting to own the land. So there's obviously going to be that tension here between Europeans and the Indians, the different Indian groups. So
You know, and then for the littlest kids in your family, it might make you want to go read, because they may not be reading this, right? They're too little, but it might make you want to go reread what happened with Pocahontas or what happened with the Pilgrims. And then with your older kids, you might want to read, there's an excellent book called Summer of the Moon. I might have gotten that backwards. Hold on. Empire of the Summer Moon, where I thought it was a pretty even-handed account of the Indian Wars across our country. You know, so in other words, as classicals, when we don't understand something, we don't give up. We go find another resource.
Mhm.
Versus someone in modern education would say, well, I'm just going to fail that test.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to look into that, Leigh, because, you know, one of the problems, and I'll fully admit I would love to do a lot of research on this, but I think people with this particular issue paint with too broad of a brush, because they're just say, oh, you know, we wiped out the Native Americans or Indians. And, you know, we're talking about individuals, and we're talking about people here. So if you're going to say someone did something wrong, you can't just say, well, a whole group of people did it. You have to name a name, you know. And so I think it's fair to expect a greater deal of specificity and evidence when we're just saying, you can't just say, well, white people or Europeans did this and wiped out in some cases, and hopefully it sounds like this book might address this, the Indians would have wronged the Europeans, because it wasn't like the Indians occupied all the land. I know that's another conversation. I suppose maybe this is just the time where I wanted to get that off my chest.
Get it off your chest.
Yeah, so I think that's fair, and, you know, even conservatives, I think, can look at it too simply. We're talking about 100-year, 150-year period. We're talking about different European groups, different Indian groups. You can't just say, oh, we drove them out of the land. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look into that book. I'll put it on my list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just a lot of details. So there's another contradiction similar to that. In section 9, it says, as soon as there shall be 5,000 free male inhabitants of full age, and then you go down to the very bottom, and it says, there shall neither be slavery nor involuntary servitude. So it's like they're admitting it's there, but then they're saying, but we shouldn't be doing it. And so that's how I read it. And that's how we, the Indian thing, the slave thing, we read it with modern eyes and not really knowing enough. Go ahead, Jennifer, you want to say something?
One thing I wanted, so I don't know, take this or leave this, okay? One thing I noticed, and I think that this may address some of the tension that you and Michelle were talking about in the beginning, when we were discussing this section 8 about the Indian titles shall have been extinguished. That's a passive verb voice. So they're not saying who is extinguishing these titles. Are the Indians releasing them, or are the settlers taking them? And I think to what you're saying, Leigh, about looking at it through modern eyes, it could be very easy to read it through modern eyes and see the actor in that who is not named to be the settlers taking the titles. But I don't know enough about the writers of this document to know what their thoughts were, what their intent was. Was it left intentionally ambiguous so that it could be either one, or was there another intent behind having that be in the passive voice? I don't know.
Yep.
You went right to the essentials, didn't you?
I did.
But even okay, so let's go one more thing because of the time we have. Then Nicole, I want to hear what you want to say too. So it talks about feasible. Kevin brought that up. Those of us who own land with mortgage on it, but the title's in our name, that's a fee simple holding. Versus like if you live in Japan or even some expensive communities in the United States where land is scarce, you can actually get a mortgage. You can actually get a title for like 100 years, but it's not fee simple. So just that term of fee simple is a legal term for how the ownership is occurring. So that's going to be beyond our challenge 1 and 2 students' ability to understand, in the sense of we don't use that word anymore unless you're actually a real estate agent. They know what that means.
Mhm.
And then the other thing we do, because we're running short on time, and Nicole, if you want to talk about this, great. Otherwise, I'm just going to say something really quick. Is it's really interesting to read through the sections where they determine what makes a territory eligible to be a state and how it has to be managed until it is eligible to be a state. Right. So there's a lot of statistics and numbers in this document. And just like if you go through 1 Kings 7 and look at all the math terms that are in the Bible in that chapter, you could just say, you know what, this is too hard for us, but let's circle every math term. Let's circle every 25 and 3 and 1,500 and the numbers. That's another way to go through a document you're not familiar with. There's so many ways to survey unfamiliar material, but we were trained in school that you have to raise your hand and get an A.
Mhm.
So, okay, how about you, Nicole? What do you want to talk about?
Well, this is kind of more like a kind of that historical context kind of question that I maybe don't know a lot, but just kind of reading it, I was wondering if there was already a lot of governance going on, and that's kind of why I can't give you any specific example because I really just skimmed the document, but if there was a lot of self-governance already going on in that area, and is that why they needed this document, or is it just more like that preparation for this is eventually going to be a state? That's kind of some of the questions that I had when I was reading it.
So if you think about the context of it, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were already ambassadors to France and England during this time period. So it's like the Louisiana Purchase were looming, and going westward was going to come quick. And so I think it was on their minds to say, to the left of Virginia, just to the west of Virginia, they want to become a country, our state. How do we do this? So
Yeah,
and there was
sorry, go ahead, Leigh.
no,
Sorry.
you good.
I was going to say, I looked at this as that this was sort of the pass interference document that they were preparing for this territory to be settled. And rather than be like Europe, where other countries would then, or a new country would be established that would share a border with the United States, they were, forward thinking. Let's try and nip this in the bud, because we don't want to be a Europe where we've got countries that share border lines. And so I think they were very purposeful in, okay, at first this is one big area and you have one governor. It was very much like a martial law type of a situation. Then as the settlements grew, you got those numbers in, then this is telling you, okay, this is your next step in being part of us. And so that's where I took it, is that this was sort of like that. Let's just prepare for the future. We're looking ahead as to our people. We know people like to move. We know that they are looking for different ways of living. So let's just ensure that we're all on the same page.
So now that we had this 45-minute conversation, maybe we could go through it again and talk about the biblical principles. When you first asked me that, Kevin, I was like, wow, that is like so far beyond my understanding at this point.
Wow.
So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I have that flaw. I think I should probably start out a little more simply. I think it might have been better to ask that at the end, but
Yeah.
I will admit, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but that's really what I think about during the day. So,
yeah.
There are many principles in here that actually do foreshadow the U.S. Constitution. There's a Republican form of civil government in Article 5. There is no slavery or involuntary servitude, which is in Amendment 13, which actually, I know there's a statute on this, but involuntary servitude is actually constitutional. but there are statutes that supposedly prohibit it. But nevertheless, and then in Article 2, I mentioned cruel and unusual punishment. And then there's some language in Article 4 about the Commerce Clause. And, we could talk about that some other time, but that's a modern, the liberals have used the Commerce Clause as a modern form of tyranny and big civil government on the federal level. So there's just a lot here, and we could, just continue like individually just exploring the different principles here and how we've got our modern U.S. Constitution. So this is good stuff.
Yeah, so this was, people don't refer to this way very often. Kevin, you and I were together at a meeting when a gentleman who's a friend of ours said, do you talk about it in the terms of the 4 organic documents of the United States? And this is one of the 4. It's the Declaration, the Articles, Northwest Ordinance, and the Constitution. That those 4 documents made us who we are as far as a legal system, of course, with all that biblical background, as well as the Locke and what's that guy's name? Blackburn? No.
Blackstone.
Blackstone, yeah. So we had all those principles too. But these are the 4 that our state constitutions are supposed to be paying attention to and no longer do. These are the 4 that all of our children should have been reading all along and no longer do. So we wanted to make sure that they were part of the classical conversations curriculum and have this discussion during the 4th of July month, so that just to honor the great foundation of our country. So thanks for humoring me. Kevin, you want to close in prayer?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the people that have come before us, not just the men, but also the women that supported them. And we just love what you've given to us, a country where we can express ourselves even improperly at times, and have others come to us also in free speech and correct us. So we know that is a great gift that you've given to us in being correctable. We're just so in awe at what you've created here, this political nation, this group of people. And we know, of course, that you always have a remnant, and we always want to be part of that remnant and have it produce a even greater nation. Lord, I'm just reminded of what Bill Federer told us last week, that we can have a seed, but if we plant it in poor soil, it's not going to grow. So we just ask that you continue to sanctify us, and you continue to help us lead other people to Jesus and then biblical principles, and see how those apply to modern times, even imperfectly, so that we can get even closer and closer, little by little, to your son Jesus and the way that he did things. And I pray going forward for our book club that we can continue to help people and learn ourselves. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.